President Donald Trump sat at his desk in the Oval Office, flipping through his daily briefings. Reports on international relations, economic policies, and national security filled the stack of documents before him. But amid the usual paperwork, one envelope stood out. It was handwritten, its edges slightly worn, postmarked from a small town in Montana. The sender, Captain Michael Powell, an 83-year-old retired Navy officer. Trump raised an eyebrow and carefully unfolded the letter. It was short, but carried a weight beyond its words. Mr. President, I've served my country in ways most people will never understand. Before my time is up, I have something important to tell you. Something about leadership, sacrifice, and the kind of legacy that truly lasts. If you can spare a moment, I'd like to meet you. Trump sat back, tapping his fingers on the desk. He had met countless veterans before, but something about Powell's message felt different. There was no request for recognition, no demand for favors, just an old warrior with wisdom to share. His advisor glanced at the letter and shook his head. Sir, your schedule is packed. You have foreign diplomats arriving, an economic strategy meeting, and— Trump held up a hand, cutting him off. Set it up. His staff hesitated. Are you sure, Mr. President? He nodded. Some things matter more than policy meetings. And with that, the visit was arranged. No cameras, no reporters. Just a conversation between a president and a veteran who had seen more than most men ever would. The presidential motorcade moved through the quiet roads of Montana, passing through open fields and snow-dusted mountains. Finally, they arrived at a modest cabin, tucked between tall pines. No grand welcome, no media spectacle, just a small wooden porch where Captain Michael Powell sat waiting, a folded American flag resting beside him. As Trump stepped out of the vehicle, Powell stood, his movements deliberate, his spine straight despite the weight of his years. His handshake was firm, his grip carrying the strength of a man who had weathered storms most could only imagine. Mr. President, Powell said, his voice steady. Didn't think I'd see the day a commander-in-chief would come all this way. Trump smirked. Didn't think I'd see the day an old sailor would have me flying across the country for a conversation. Powell chuckled, gesturing toward a pair of chairs on the porch. Then we're both in for a surprise. Inside, the cabin was simple, but filled with memories. Books stacked on wooden shelves, medals in a small glass case, photographs of a younger Powell standing beside fellow sailors. But Powell hadn't asked Trump here for nostalgia. He had something more to say. Pouring 2 cups of coffee, he leaned forward. I served during times when this country was divided, when leadership was tested, and when sacrifice wasn't just a word. It was the price of freedom. Trump listened intently. He had built an empire, commanded a nation, but Powell had fought battles that had shaped the very foundation of America. Leadership, Powell continued, isn't about titles or power. It's about the people who come after you, the ones who stand on the ground you laid for them. Trump crossed his arms, intrigued. You think I haven't built something to last? Powell met his gaze. You've built plenty, but the real question is, will it outlive you? For the first time in a long time, Trump found himself pausing. He had spent his life winning, proving himself, leaving his mark. But what kind of mark would truly remain? Powell sighed, glancing at a framed photograph. His younger self, standing on the deck of a warship, staring into the horizon. I spent decades serving this country, but in the end, it's not the medals or the honors that matter. It's the people I lifted up along the way. He looked back at Trump, his eyes sharp. You still have time to decide what kind of legacy you'll leave. Not just in towers, policies, or speeches, but in people. Trump ran a hand over his chin, deep in thought. He had expected a conversation about war stories and old battles. But Powell had given him something else, a challenge. As he stood to leave, Trump extended his hand. Powell, despite his age, rose with the same dignity he had carried his whole life and saluted. Trump, feeling the weight of the moment, returned the salute. A week after the visit, Trump was back in the Oval Office when his secretary entered, her expression solemn. "Mr. President, we just received news. Captain Michael Powell has passed away." Trump looked up, stunned. He had just spoken to him. A man still full of fire, of purpose. The secretary hesitated before placing an envelope on his desk. "He left this for you." Trump picked it up, staring at the familiar handwriting. He exhaled, then carefully unfolded the letter. Powell's words were brief, but struck deep. "Mr. President, true leadership isn't measured by what you accomplish. It's measured by who you lift. That's how history will remember you." Trump read the letter twice. Then a third time. It was as if Powell had seen through him, understood the thoughts he never voiced. All his life, Trump had built, won, fought. But how many had he lifted? For days, Powell's words lingered. He didn't announce sweeping changes or make grand public statements. But something had shifted inside him. One afternoon, without notifying the press, he visited a program mentoring young veterans. He sat down, listened to their struggles, their aspirations, and for the first time, he saw Powell in them. The same determination, the same fire. Over time, Powell's words began to shape his decisions. In meetings, he brought up the importance of leadership beyond power, of paving the way for those who would come next. Policies shifted. Opportunities opened, not because of speeches, but because of quiet, deliberate action. Months later, a young veteran stood on a stage, receiving an award for leadership. She spoke about the mentors who had guided her, the opportunities she never thought she'd have. In the audience, unseen, Donald Trump watched silently. A small smile crossed his face as Powell's words echoed in his mind. True leadership isn't measured by what you accomplish. It's measured by who you lift. And in that moment, he knew his legacy was still being written. Months had passed since Captain Michael Powell's letter had first reached Donald Trump's desk, but its words had never left his mind. Even in the middle of high-stakes negotiations, policy meetings, and global summits, the old Navy officer's challenge lingered. Will it outlive you? Trump had spent his career proving doubters wrong, building, achieving. But Powell had asked something different of him. Not to win, but to lift others. And so, quietly, without fanfare, he started making changes. The first step was subtle. During a routine meeting on Veterans Affairs, he interrupted a policy discussion. How many of these programs actually reach the people who need them? He asked. His staff exchanged glances. We allocate funding, of course, one advisor said. Support services exist, but participation rates, not numbers, Trump cut in. Real people, the ones who come back and feel forgotten, the ones Powell was talking about. Silence. Then, a week later, he made a call. Not to a politician, not to a CEO, but to a young veteran who had written to the White House months before, detailing the struggles of returning soldiers. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, a former Navy pilot who had been advocating for better transition programs for veterans. "Sarah," he said, after she picked up, her voice startled to hear the president himself. "Tell me exactly what's broken. No filters, no political nonsense." For the next 20 minutes, she did. She talked about how too many veterans left service without a clear path forward, how job training programs were outdated, how the skills they learned in the military weren't translating into real careers. Trump listened. Really listened. By the time the call ended, he had made up his mind. You're coming to Washington. We're fixing this. Within weeks, A new mentorship program for transitioning veterans was launched. But this time, it wasn't just another government initiative buried in red tape. Trump made sure it had backing, funding, and, most importantly, veterans like Sarah at the helm. "You don't need politicians telling you what you need," he said at the program's launch. "You need people who have lived it. That's why they're in charge." No press, no grand speeches, just real results. Powell's words echoed in his mind as he watched young veterans, men and women, step up, take leadership roles, and start guiding those who followed them. He had lifted them. And for the first time in years, he felt something different. Not victory, not dominance, but purpose. One evening, long after the West Wing had quieted down, Trump sat alone in his office. A single envelope lay before him, Michael Powell's letter. He read it again, as he had many times before. But this time he picked up a pen and wrote beneath it, "I understand now." Folding the letter carefully, he placed it in a box alongside other keepsakes from his presidency. Not for display, not for anyone else, but for himself. Because Captain Powell had been right. A legacy isn't about what you achieve. It's about who you lift. Weeks passed, but Powell's words stayed with him. One evening, as Trump walked the halls of the White House, he found himself stopping outside the Roosevelt Room. Inside, portraits of past presidents lined the walls, men who had shaped the nation, each in their own way. For the first time, he wondered, what would history say about him? Would it remember the deals, the speeches, the battles fought in politics? Or would it remember the people he had lifted? Powell's voice echoed in his mind. "Will it outlive you?" Trump exhaled. He knew the answer wasn't in the past. It was in what he did next. The next morning, he made a decision. A private ceremony was arranged at Arlington National Cemetery. No press, no grand spectacle. Just a moment to honor the man who had challenged him in a way no one else had. As he stood before Powell's freshly laid gravestone, he removed his hat and placed a hand on the cool marble. "You were right," he murmured, "and I won't forget." Then, standing tall, Donald J. Trump, the man who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms, commanding attention, raised his hand in a final salute. It was not for cameras, not for history books. It was for Powell, for the lesson, for the legacy that would outlive them both. Some stories don't end with words. They end with actions. Captain Powell knew that. And now, so did Trump. But what about you? What will outlive you? Who will you lift? Because, at the end of the day, that's the only thing history remembers, and the only thing that truly matters.